I used to think silence in a marriage was normal. Not the peaceful kind. The heavy kind that sits between two people at dinner, filling every gap where conversation used to live. My husband and I had reached that point without even realizing when it started. There were no big fights, no dramatic betrayals. Just routines, predictable patterns, and long days that ended with both of us too tired to notice each other. He worked late, always had. First, I admired it. It felt like stability, like he was building something for us. But over time, late became normal, and us became an afterthought. Conversations turned into quick updates. Meals became silent. Even when he was home, it felt like he wasn't really there. I didn't complain. I told myself this was what marriage looked like after a few years. Comfortable, quiet, safe. But somewhere underneath that logic was a feeling I couldn't ignore anymore. I felt invisible. That's around the time David started coming over more often. He and my husband had been friends for years, the kind of friendship built on history and shared experiences I wasn't part of. I'd met him plenty of times before, but I'd never really noticed him. Not the way I started to notice him then. It began with small things. The way he greeted me properly, not just a distracted nod. The way he actually asked how I was and waited for an answer. First, I thought it was just politeness. But then I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't used to that kind of attention anymore. One evening, my husband invited him over after work. I remember I was in the kitchen preparing something simple, nothing special. I heard them laughing in the other room, the kind of easy laughter that felt distant from me. I stayed where I was, focused on what I was doing until David walked in. He didn't have to. Most people didn't. But he leaned against the counter and watched for a second before speaking. "You always do this alone?" he asked casually. I shrugged. "Someone has to." It wasn't meant to sound bitter, but it did. I noticed it the moment it left my mouth. He noticed too. But instead of brushing it off like my husband would have, he stayed. "Seems like a lot for one person," he said. I didn't respond right away. I just continued what I was doing, pretending it didn't matter. But something about the way he said it, simple, observant, made it hard to ignore. That was the first moment. After that, things didn't change all at once. It was gradual, almost unnoticeable if you weren't paying attention. But I was. The next few times he came over, he found reasons to end up near me. Not in an obvious way. It always felt natural, casual. But it happened enough that I started expecting it. And then there were the conversations. They weren't inappropriate. Not even close. But they were different. He asked questions my husband hadn't asked in years. About what I liked, what I missed, what I used to enjoy doing before everything became routine. At first I answered lightly. Surface-level responses. Safe answers. But he didn't rush the conversation. He listened in a way that made silence feel comfortable instead of awkward. And slowly, without realizing when it happened, I started saying more. Things I hadn't even admitted to myself. One night, my husband stepped out to take a call, leaving the two of us alone in the living room. It was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that used to make me uncomfortable. But this time it didn't. "You don't seem happy," David said. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't intrusive. Just direct. I let out a small laugh, trying to deflect. "That obvious?" "Only if you're paying attention," he replied. That answer stayed with me longer than it should have. I could have shut it down, changed the subject, walked away. That would have been the right thing to do. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there and let the conversation continue. And that was where the lines started to blur. After that, every interaction carried something unspoken. Not enough to call out. Not enough to confront. But enough to feel. A look that lasted a second too long. A pause in conversation that felt heavier than it should. The kind of moments that could still be dismissed. If you wanted to. I told myself it didn't mean anything. That I was reading into things because I felt lonely. That it was harmless. But deep down I knew better. Because I started noticing things I shouldn't have. The way his tone changed slightly when he spoke to me. The way he seemed more aware of me than anyone else in the room. And the way I started becoming aware of him in return. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. That's what made it dangerous. It felt normal. One evening, I was setting out drinks while they sat nearby talking. I picked up an extra glass without thinking and poured something into it. When I turned, I realized I was holding it out toward him. "Here," I said. It was a simple gesture. Nothing unusual. But the moment stretched longer than it should have as he took it from my hand. Our fingers brushed for just a second. That was it. But it was enough. He didn't pull away immediately. Neither did I. And in that tiny, almost invisible moment, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. He looked at me differently after that. Not in a way anyone else would notice. But I did. And what unsettled me the most was that I didn't look away. That night, after he left and the house returned to its usual silence, I couldn't shake the feeling. Nothing had happened, and yet, something had. I lay awake longer than usual, replaying that moment in my mind, trying to convince myself it didn't matter, that it was nothing. But the truth was harder to ignore. Because for the first time in a long time, I had felt something. And once you feel that, even for a second, you don't forget it, you start waiting for it again. And that was the moment I realized something had already begun, whether I wanted to admit it or not. I started noticing the pattern before I admitted it to myself. It wasn't something obvious, nothing you could point at and call out. If anyone had asked, I would have said everything was the same. Same house, same routine, same quiet dinners. But underneath that, something had shifted in a way I couldn't undo. David began showing up more often. At least that's what it felt like. Maybe it was always like this and I had just never paid attention before. But now I did. Now, I noticed the timing, the way his visits somehow lined up with the evenings my husband was too distracted to engage with anything beyond his phone or his work. And I noticed myself reacting to it. First, I tried to ignore it. I stayed busy, kept conversations short, avoided being alone in the same space with him for too long. It felt like the responsible thing to do, like I was still in control. But control is easy when nothing is pulling at you. It gets harder when something is. One evening, my husband asked me to bring tea into the living room. A simple request. I made it without thinking, placed the tray down and turned to leave. That should have been it. But David stopped me. "You don't sit with us anymore?" He asked. It wasn't a complaint. Just a quiet observation. "I have things to do," I replied, not looking directly at him. "You always do," he said. There was something in his tone that made me pause. Not enough to make it obvious, but enough that I felt it. I hesitated for a second too long, then sat down. My husband barely noticed. The conversation started normally. Work, random stories, things that didn't require much thought. But slowly, like it always did, it shifted. My husband drifted back into his phone, occasionally nodding, barely present, and somehow, without anyone acknowledging it, the conversation became just between me and David. He asked simple questions. What I'd done that day. Whether I still painted. I'd mentioned it once, weeks ago, in passing. I was surprised he remembered. "I haven't in a while," I said. "Why not?" I shrugged. Didn't feel like it mattered. He didn't respond immediately. Just looked at me in a way that made me uncomfortable, like he was trying to understand something I hadn't fully said. "It mattered enough for you to remember it," he said finally. I didn't have an answer for that. Moments like that started happening more often. Small conversations that stayed with me longer than they should have. Things that lingered in my mind hours after he'd left, replaying in a way that felt personal. And that's when I realized it wasn't just him. It was me too. I started anticipating those moments. Not consciously at first. But I caught myself thinking about what I'd say if the conversation turned a certain way. Wondering if he'd notice something new about me. Catching myself paying attention to details that shouldn't have mattered. It wasn't physical. Not yet. But it was something just as dangerous. Because it felt like being seen again. One afternoon, my husband wasn't home when David stopped by. That alone should have been enough for me to keep my distance. To tell him to come back later. But I didn't. "It's just me," I said when I opened the door. He hesitated for a second, like he was deciding something. Then he stepped inside. "I won't stay long," he said. But neither of us moved to end the moment. I told myself it was harmless. That we were just talking. That there was nothing wrong with the conversation. But the air felt different. Quieter. More aware. We ended up in the kitchen again. It seemed to be where these moments always happened. Maybe because it gave me something to do with my hands, something to focus on besides the tension I was starting to recognize. I poured 2 glasses of juice without asking, setting one in front of him. "You always do that," he said. "Do what?" "Act like you're expecting me." I paused just for a second. "I'm not." He didn't argue. But he didn't look convinced either. We stood there longer than necessary, the silence stretching but not breaking. It wasn't uncomfortable. That was the problem. Felt easy. Natural. Like we had already crossed into something familiar without realizing when it happened. I picked up a small plate from the counter. Something I had made earlier. Nothing special. Just something to fill the space. You can try it, I said, holding it out slightly. It was such a simple thing. Something I'd done 100 times for guests. But this time it didn't feel like that. He stepped closer instead of reaching out immediately. Are you sure? He asked. I nodded. Even though I wasn't sure what he meant. He took it, but his hand brushed mine again, slower this time. Not accidental. Not something you could dismiss. Neither of us pulled away quickly, and in that moment something unspoken settled between us. He tasted it, but his eyes didn't leave mine. It's good, he said quietly. I should have stepped back. Created distance. Said something normal to break whatever that was. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, aware of how close we were standing, aware of how easy it would be to cross a line neither of us had clearly defined yet. You're not just talking about this, are you? I asked before I could stop myself. The words hung there, heavier than anything we'd said before. For a second, he didn't respond, and I thought maybe I'd imagined everything. Maybe I'd gone too far on my own, but then he exhaled slowly. If things were different, he started, then stopped. That should have been the end of it. The moment to step away. To pretend it never happened, but I didn't move. Neither did he. I wouldn't pretend I don't feel it, he finished. The room felt smaller after that. Quieter in a way that wasn't safe anymore. And for the first time I realized this wasn't just harmless attention, this was something real. Something that, if I let it continue, wouldn't stay contained in moments like this. I should have ended it right there. But the truth was, I didn't want to. And that was the moment everything became irreversible. After that day, everything felt sharper. Not louder, not more obvious, just more defined. Like the line we had been circling finally came into focus, and even though neither of us said it out loud, we both knew exactly where it was. And more importantly, how close we were to crossing it. For a few days there was distance. Not physical distance. He still came by, still sat in the same room, still spoke like nothing had changed. But the space between words carried weight now. Every glance lasted a second too long. Every pause felt intentional. We were careful. Too careful. My husband didn't notice. Or maybe he just didn't look closely enough to see it. That somehow made it worse. The normalcy of everything around us made what was happening underneath feel almost unreal. Like it existed in a separate layer no one else could touch. I told myself it had to stop. That whatever this was, it had gone far enough. There was still time to step back, to let it fade into something unspoken and forgotten. But thoughts like that only work when both people are willing to let go. And neither of us was. It happened on a night that should have been like any other. My husband left earlier than usual. Some last-minute work issue that needed his attention. He barely explained it. Just grabbed his keys and left with a quick, "Don't wait up." I didn't think much of it. Until I heard the knock later. I already knew who it was before I opened the door. There was a moment, a small, almost insignificant moment, where I could have chosen differently. I could have not answered. I could have said it wasn't a good time. But I didn't. When I opened the door, David didn't step in immediately. He looked at me like he was waiting for something. Permission, maybe. Or confirmation. "He's not here," I said. "I know," he replied. That should have been enough to end it. Instead, I stepped aside. He walked in slowly, like he understood exactly what that decision meant. Neither of us rushed to speak. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything we hadn't said. "I wasn't sure if I should come," he admitted. "You're here," I replied. He let out a quiet breath, almost like he'd been holding it in longer than he realized. "Yeah," he said. "I am." We didn't move to the living room this time. We stayed where we were, close enough that I could feel the shift in the air between us. It wasn't accidental anymore. Nothing about this was. "This isn't a good idea," I said, even though I hadn't stepped back. "I know." But he didn't move either. That was the problem. We both knew exactly what this was, and neither of us was willing to be the one to stop it. For a moment, it felt like time stretched out, giving us one last chance to choose differently. Then he spoke again, quieter this time. "Tell me to leave." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an offer. A final exit. All I had to do was say it. But I didn't. Instead, I shook my head just slightly. That was all it took. The distance between us disappeared in a way that felt inevitable, like it had already happened long before this moment. There was no hesitation after that, no second-guessing. Just a release of everything that had been building, everything we had been holding back. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't careless. If anything, that made it worse. Because it felt intentional. Real. For a while, nothing else existed. Not the house, not the silence we had broken, not the consequences waiting on the other side of it. Just the feeling of finally not holding back. And then it was over. The shift was immediate. Not dramatic, not explosive. Just quiet. Too quiet. I stepped back first. Not far, just enough to feel the space between us again. Felt different now. He looked at me like he was trying to read something in my expression, something I wasn't sure I could even understand myself. Neither of us spoke right away. There were no words that could undo what had just happened. No way to reframe it into something harmless or accidental. It was a choice point, one we had both made. Are you okay? He asked finally. It was such a simple question, but it hit harder than anything else. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure what that meant anymore. Yeah, I said quietly. I think so. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was I felt everything at once. A rush of something I hadn't felt in years, mixed with a weight I couldn't ignore, because the moment itself might have been over. But what it meant was just beginning. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. This doesn't have to be complicated. I almost laughed at that. It already was. There was no version of this that stayed simple. Not anymore. I looked at him. Really looked at him. And for the first time since it happened, something shifted inside me. Not regret exactly, but awareness. This wasn't just a moment we could lock away and forget. This was something that would follow us, change things. I think it already is, I said. He didn't argue. That's how I knew he felt it too. And in that silence, standing there with the weight of what we had done settling in around us, I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't just about crossing a line. It was about what came after. Because once something like this happens, it doesn't stay in that moment. It spreads into the way you think, the way you act, the way you look at everything that used to feel certain. And as I stood there, listening to the quiet that had returned but no longer felt the same, one thought kept repeating in my mind. This wasn't over. Not even close. The next morning felt unfamiliar, even though nothing around me had changed. The same walls, the same routine, the same quiet hum of a life that had always felt predictable. But I wasn't the same inside it anymore. That was the first thing I noticed. Not guilt, not panic. Just a shift I couldn't reverse. I moved through the day carefully. Like if I stayed calm enough, everything would settle back into place. My husband came home that evening like he always did, distracted, halfway present, already talking about work before he even sat down. I watched him differently. Not with suspicion, not even with resentment, just awareness. The kind you get when something breaks and suddenly you see all the cracks that were always there. He didn't notice anything had changed. That should have made it easier. It didn't. Because now I knew exactly how much could happen right in front of him, without him ever seeing it. David didn't come by that day. Or the next. The silence between us stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy, waiting, like both of us knew avoiding each other wouldn't undo anything. I told myself that was a good sign. Distance meant clarity. Space meant control. But control had already slipped. When he finally did come back, it wasn't planned. At least, that's what we pretended, and my husband was there too. Sitting just a few feet away. Completely unaware of what existed beneath the surface. The conversation was normal. Too normal. It felt almost rehearsed, like we were both playing roles we hadn't fully stepped out of yet. I avoided looking at him at first. But awareness doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. I could feel it in the room, in the pauses between words, in the way everything seemed slightly more deliberate than before. At one point, my husband got up to take a call again. It was becoming a pattern I couldn't ignore anymore. The moment he stepped out, the silence returned, different this time. You've been avoiding me, David said quietly. I kept my voice steady. Maybe I should. Do you want to? That question stayed in the air longer than it should have. I could have said yes. It would have been the right answer. The safe one. The one that closed the door before things got worse, but honesty doesn't always come at the right time. No, I admitted that was the problem, because neither of us wanted to step back, even knowing exactly what it would cost. We can't keep pretending that didn't happen, he said. I'm not pretending, I replied. I'm just trying to think. About what? About what this is supposed to be now. He didn't answer immediately, and that silence told me more than anything else could have. There was no clear answered no version of this that fit neatly into something manageable. My husband's voice echoed faintly from the other room, still on his call, still unaware that everything had already changed. I don't think this was just a mistake, David said finally. I looked at him then, really looked at him, searching for something certain in his expression. That doesn't make it better, I said. No, he agreed. It doesn't. That should have been the moment we ended it. The moment we both recognized the weight of it and chose to walk away before it pulled us in deeper. But that's not how things like this work. Because it wasn't just about what had happened. It was about what it revealed, about everything I had been ignoring in my own life. Everything I had accepted without question. Everything that suddenly didn't feel enough anymore. And that realization was harder to face than the mistake itself. The days after that became a quiet balancing act. Nothing obvious. No dramatic confrontations. Just small careful choices. Conversations that stayed on the surface when others were around, and silences that said too much when they weren't. My husband started noticing something, though not what you'd expect. You've been distant, he said one night. The irony almost made me laugh. I'm just tired, I replied. He accepted that answer without hesitation. That was when it hit me the hardest. Not the guilt. Not the fear. The distance. It had been there long before any of this started. Long before David. Long before that moment in the kitchen or the decision at the door. I had been drifting away quietly, and no one had tried to stop it. Not even me. And now, standing in the middle of something I couldn't easily undo, I had to face a truth I had avoided for too long. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about choice. Every small moment that led here. Every time I stayed silent instead of speaking up. Every time I accepted less than what I needed and told myself it was enough. David didn't create that, he just made me see it. One evening, I found myself alone again, the house quiet in the same familiar way. But it didn't feel the same anymore. Nothing did. I thought about everything that had happened. Not just the moment we crossed the line, but everything before it. The slow build. The quiet shifts. The way it all felt inevitable once it started. And I realized something I couldn't ignore. This didn't end with getting caught. It didn't even end with stopping, because the real change had already happened inside me. I couldn't go back to not seeing it. Not feeling it. Not questioning everything I had once accepted without thinking. Footsteps approached the door, and I knew my husband was home again. Another evening. Another routine. But as I stood there, I understood something clearly for the first time. The line I crossed wasn't just between right and wrong. It was between who I had been and who I was now. And no matter what I chose next, there was no going back to before I knew the difference.